The Internal Revenue Service faces a cloudy future in information security. Like many agencies, the IRS is waiting for what their role will be in the cybersecurity of our nation. How is information security different from cybersecurity, a relatively new term that is being thrown around? Until now, the IRS has been responsible for the security of information. This is a responsibility to the individual citizens within the nation. Cybersecurity represents a responsibility to the digital infrastructure of our nation. So in this new endeavor, where does the IRS stand? Welcome to the cumulative presentation on the cybersecurity posture of the IRS. I am Matt Stephenson of the University of Maryland, University College. I prepared this presentation per the assignment of Dr. Amy Harding, professor of the CSIA 412 Security Policy Analysis course. In this presentation, we will be covering three main topics. First will be the impact of recently proposed legislation on the IRS. This will be followed by an overview of various encryption methods and a recommended implementation of encryption for the IRS. Finally, the results of a privately conducted report on the IRS's compliance with NIST 800 TAC 53 will be reviewed. The recommendation for the IRS based on that report will also be covered. Let's first take a look at what has been attempted in the recent past. Cyber legislation has faced numerous difficulties in gaining a foothold, but a combination of policies and regulations are beginning to take place. It will not be long before cyber legislation is enacted. Can we learn about the future legislation through these past attempts and how they will affect the IRS? In May of 2011, a cybersecurity proposal was presented. This proposal had a number of changes that would affect the IRS. Let's take a look at two of those changes. The first of these would be data breach notification. Under the new proposal, notification for reporting breaches would extend beyond the current requirement limited to personally identifiable information, or PII. Information outside of PII would now require protection legally by the IRS. Further, as the IRS processes an extensive amount of PII, this new proposal would require extensive IRS-wide internal policy changes. Breaches would now be handled in a more uniform manner. With these changes to data breach notification come amendments to the Federal Information Security Management Act, or FISMA. This new proposal would require FISMA, a separate act, to be updated. This update would include periodic testing of information systems to evaluate the effectiveness of the policies, procedures, and practices. These tests would happen at a frequency based upon the risk level associated with the agency network. What is the IRS Information System risk level? To figure that out, let's switch over to the Cybersecurity Act of 2012. The Cybersecurity Act of 2012 also included many proposed changes that would affect the IRS. Included in these are the designation of critical infrastructure, criminalization of damaging critical infrastructure systems, and the protection of critical infrastructure. The designation of critical infrastructure was included in the Cybersecurity Act of 2012. Under these guidelines, the IRS was designated as critical infrastructure based on the fact that the IRS network, the UNS, would heavily affect the U.S. economy if its operations were to become disrupted. Further, the Cybersecurity Act of 2012 would also bring criminal charges against anyone who disrupted such critical infrastructure as the IRS UNS. The criminalization of damaging critical infrastructure systems would bring legal backing to cyber legislation. If and when a cyber attack occurs against the IRS, it would be considered a criminal act by this new legislation. This would bring specific repercussions to attacking critical federal systems as opposed to any other information system. 2012 outlines required protection measures for critical infrastructure, including the IRS. These requirements would mean new changes to IRS policies and practices. Some of these requirements would include a disaster recovery and business continuity plan being implemented, along with specific requirements for the hardening of the IRS UNS, and as seen before, new guidelines on reporting incidents that disrupt IRS UNS operations. These proposed pieces of legislation would represent a major overhaul of the IRS cybersecurity policies. This is a higher level, less technical overview of the changes. Policy lifecycle development is based off of industry best practices and federal regulation. To understand what this would look like for the IRS, Let's take a look at some various encryption types to see what a lower level, more technical viewpoint would look like for the IRS. Welcome to the mathematical tornado of cryptography. There are numerous encryption standards available today. Three popular and common encryption types are DES, triple DES, and AES. DES should be considered the least secure of these three options. This is because it only has a 64-bit key, of which only 56 bits are the actual key. 8 of those bits are allocated to error detection. While the length of the key does not determine the validity of an encryption method, let's take a look at why the length of the key is so important when comparing DES to triple DES. Triple DES is exactly what the name implies. DES performed 3 times. This means that there are 3 56-bit keys put into play, or arguably a single 168-bit key. While the length of the key does not determine its effectiveness, 3 keys are distinctively better than 1. If triple DES is good, what about quadruple DES? What could be better than multiple keys? The answer is the Randall algorithm, as implemented in AES encryption methodology. This method generates 128, 192, or 256-bit keys. While some of the keys in DES and triple DES could be considered longer, it is important to note that the Randall algorithm is stronger than DES or triple DES. Also, each block of information is separately encrypted with AES encryption methodology. To give light to the power of AES, take a look at an example given by Mohit Arora, a senior systems engineer and security architect. In Mr. Arora's calculations, a lowly 128-bit AES key has 1.1 times 10 to the 77th possibilities. He went on to calculate that using the world's fastest supercomputer available at the time, it would take over 1 billion years to crack the AES key. While it is possible in theory, it is not currently possible in practice. This means it is recommended that the IRS implement AES across all of its systems. Strong encryption makes for stronger security. Data encryption is just one area where federal legislation could potentially have an impact on the IRS. Lastly, a private report was generated for this course based on the IRS's compliance with NIST 800 TAC 53, which is a document outlining guidelines for system security. A few control methods were randomly selected from operational controls, managerial controls, and technical controls required by the NIST 800 TAC 53 document. Again, a document that outlines guidelines for system security. Let's take a look at the results of this report. According to the private assessment of the IRS UNS that was created for this course, it was revealed that the IRS is NIST 800 TAC 53 compliant, with one exception: vulnerability scanning. Vulnerability scanning is a technical method in which a security professional is able to scan a network for any known weaknesses. This allows the professional to patch those flaws and prevent attacks in those areas. You could liken it to finding the holes in a boat before it sinks. With this discovery came a set of 5 recommendations. 1. Research the vulnerability scanning options that are available to the IRS. There are numerous suites available, though federal contracts may already exist that the IRS can emulate. A study of the UNS infrastructure will need to be conducted in order to determine a best fit. 2. From the options that are researched in the study of the UNS infrastructure, a best fit vulnerability scanning solution should be decided on. This solution will require a few changes to policies and practices. Leading us to number 3, develop a vulnerability scanning policy. This policy will need to include the chosen solution along with how it will be implemented systems-wide. A life cycle for the solution will need to be determined, as well as who will be responsible for the system. 4th, and arguably most importantly, implement the vulnerability scanning solution in accordance with the new policy. It is ultimately important that the IRS begins scanning for holes in its infrastructure. Lastly, this report only selected a few of the multitude of controls outlined in NIST 800 TAC 53. The IRS should take it upon itself to review its policy in full for compliance with NIST 800 TAC 53. It will not only strengthen its cybersecurity posture now, but also prepare it for possible future legislation. We've covered a lot today. Recent legislation attempts propose heavy impacts for the IRS. It would be wise to prepare for future legislation by learning from these past proposals. Technical decisions must be made, and industry best practices were portrayed in the overview and recommendation on an encryption methodology. Lastly, a review of the IRS cybersecurity profile found the IRS to be compliant with NIST 800 TAC 53 with one exception, vulnerability scanning. Remediary steps were outlined, and a further study was recommended.